Today we will continue the conversation about Tony Rice with a very special guest. I am so thrilled and humbled and honored to have the great John Reischman joining us today. John is one of the finest mandolin pickers out there and is absolutely one of my favorite musicians. I have listened to his albums countless times. His very first album, North of the Border, on Rounder Records. I've listened to this one non-stop, only stopping to put in his more recent album, The Harmonic Tone Revealers, which, as I'll mention during the interview, is one of my favorite albums ever. Just such an incredible piece of music to listen to. He was part of the Tony Rice unit for a couple years. They made a couple albums together. First one was Still Inside from 1981 on Rounder Records, and then they made another album the next year titled Backwaters. We'll talk a little bit about those, some of what's new for him with the Jaybirds and his own work, and some memories of working with the great Tony Rice. So let's take a look at that conversation. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it. I wanted to talk to you about a couple of things because, first of all, I think that the Tony Rice unit from the era that you were in it and those two albums are really not talked about as much as, for example, like the Manzanita album or various other projects. I think these, and partially because they were never released in their entirety on CD, which I think is a big disappointment. But nonetheless, I still find that even the average Tony Rice fans are not as familiar with these two records, and there's certainly not as much discussion about them. So I wanted to talk about those. We'll get into some other things later, but I thought maybe if you could start by sharing a bit of how that lineup came to be, how you all met,
Sure.
how the record started. Like, was it a coincidence or was it super planned? Just kind of start with that.
Sure. Well, I met Tony in, I guess, maybe the late 70s, and he would come to a club that I used to play at with the band I was in called the Good Old Persons. And he was kind of a night owl, so maybe he'd just be out, going around different places, and he'd come to the club because it was the Bluegrass Club in San Francisco. And I met him there, and so he heard me play a bit. And then when he parted ways with David Grissman, I guess late 79, early 80, he decided he wanted to form a touring version of the Tony Rice unit, which was a name he used for these recording projects up to that point, one of which was the Manzanita. I think that was billed as the Tony Rice unit. And then he had made a couple new acoustic CDs, or not CDs at the time, but LPs, acoustics, and then Mar West, and that was also under the Tony Rice unit. But it was all, just friends of his, Richard Green and Sam Bush, and Todd Phillips wasn't a touring outfit. So when he decided he wanted to put a band together, I don't know exactly. I mean, he knew of me, and maybe someone recommended me as well, because he only heard me playing, bluegrass. And so I heard through the grapevine. I can't remember who told me this, but they said he was trying to get a hold of me. So I called him up. He says, "Yeah, well, I'm putting together a band, and I'm interested. So if you want to come over, I'll talk to you about it." So I went there and we talked, and he kind of described what he had envisioned, and gave me a couple. Actually, I don't think Mara West was out yet. He just gave me acoustics, copy of that, and some charts. And he says, "Why don't you see what you can do with these? Come back and we'll play." And so I went away for 2 weeks, and was stressed out,
Sure.
thinking about the opportunity. This awesome musician, and these mandolin players he played with up to that point were my heroes. But I went and learned, I think it was mainly Gasology, which is a really hard tune, and
Right.
old Gray Coat, which was a little more accessible. And I went back to his place, and he just had this great positive reaction. He said, "Well, that's it. I'm not looking for another mandolin player." So that was awesome. And he always imagined Todd Phillips playing bass with him. And at that time, I think Todd had been burned out on the whole Grissman quintet experience, and he left the Bay Area and moved to Whidbey Island in Washington State, and it was just kind of isolated up there. But I guess he'd always planned on coming back to play with Tony. But in the meantime, Tony was trying to complete the band by finding a fiddler, which took a while. And but during that time, I'd keep going over to Tony's house and playing some, and we'd work on the tunes and hang out and just spend time together. And that was from February of 1980 to I guess December of '80. So it was a long time just hanging out.
Right.
And I guess in the fall, he had met Fred Carpenter, and Fred signed on to play fiddle. Fred's from Maine, and he's great fiddler, contest style fiddler primarily at that point, and a friend of Mark O'Connor's. But he came
Right.
out and really was into it and really worked hard on that stuff. And then Todd came back from Washington State, and we rehearsed because Tony had booked 3 gigs for early December
Hmm.
1980, and I think it was the Keystone Palo Alto, the Inn of the Beginning in Cotati, and the Great American Music Hall in San Francisco, which was
Right.
the primary the showcase music venue for jazz, and that was kind of home base for the David Grisman Quintet too. So we rehearsed a bunch and learned, put together 2 sets and played those shows, and then they went over well, and then the next year, I can't remember if it was January, February, we went into the studio and recorded Still Inside. And
Hmm.
he had a lot of tunes for that recording. I can't remember how many. Maybe there's 12 on that,
Yeah, I think.
and I think that's the one you mentioned. That did
Yeah.
not every one of those tunes made it onto the CD release, which is called,
Yeah.
I think it's Mar West and Still Inside are put together on a CD
Right.
called Devlin.
Right.
And there's a
Yeah.
David Grisman tune on there called Zagani that didn't make it, and
Right.
I can't remember what the other tune might have been. But so that was the first time I was ever in the studio was with Tony Rice. So
Oh, wow.
it's pretty awesome place to start your
Yeah.
recording career. And I was really, flattered that he wanted to record my original tune, Birdland Breakdown, too. So
Right.
that was great. It was really quite exciting, and it was recorded at 1750 Arch Street, which is where the original David Grisman Quintet record was recorded, and a lot of great acoustic records later on. The Bluegrass Album Band recorded there, and
Yeah.
so on. So it was a planned thing. He wanted to have this touring unit, as he called it, and that's pretty much how it
Yeah.
all happened.
Was Fred Carpenter, was he living out there as well at the same time, or did he come, or
He
did
he
he have to
moved
move
out.
out? Ah,
Yeah,
okay.
he got the gig and he moved out.
Ah, okay.
And yeah, and let's see. I'm trying to, I've been thinking so much about those days lately.
Yeah.
But Fred, yeah, he moved out, and but I think he was in Maine, in the
Hmm.
state of Maine, where he grew up. And then nowadays he's in Nashville, and he owns a violin store there.
Right, right. Yeah, that's how I first met him, was as a contest fiddler, like you said. And then afterwards, then I
Yeah,
discovered him on Still Inside.
yeah, right. Yeah, he's really a great musician.
Yeah.
And so all those first gigs were in the Bay Area, and we continued to play shows. Not going too far afield from California, but I think there were a couple trips up to Oregon and Washington, and I guess it was in November of '81 we did a national tour that went from Salt Lake City to Houston, to Chapel
Hmm.
Hill, North Carolina, up to New York City, and then a couple gigs in Vermont. So that was great for me because I'd never been a lot of those places. Being a West Coast guy, it's a big country, so you don't necessarily travel unless you have a good reason to. And
Right.
that was a good reason to play in New York City, played the Bottom Line, and
Hmm.
it was pretty heady.
Right. If you could describe some of those shows for me, because like were they ever at like any? Well, I don't want to assume, but I would assume they weren't at like bluegrass festivals necessarily. How were they billed? Like, was it billed, like as an acoustic jazz group, or I'm just curious how, in that era how that music was billed as.
Well, I don't. I think it was just called the Tony Rice Unit,
Mm.
and people definitely wanted to hear him sing. That,
Uh-huh.
and I think you mentioned how those recordings are not mentioned as much as some of his other things, and I think that's why, because his main notoriety and people were interested in him, as a bluegrass musician who was a singer and guitar player. And when he started, he just wanted to play this acoustic instrumental music, and
Yeah.
people would holler for him to sing it, and he never did. So, which I respect him for. It would have been fine with me. He's a great singer,
That was
but I
actually.
can't remember exactly if Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. There's a little lag.
Sorry.
That was actually one of my questions. Was did he ever throw in like an old standard or a bluegrass tune there at the end? But you answered that, so that's really interesting, and I agree with you. I'm glad he did stick to what he was doing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can't remember exactly if it was billed specifically as instrumental jazz, but the venues, were not bluegrass venues,
Mm-hmm.
except the last gig the Tony Rice Unit played in that incarnation was at Winfield.
Mm.
And at that point, his Fred had left, and Wyatt, his younger brother, came in on guitar. And since Wyatt was such a good Clarence White style player, Tony would we do Beaumont Rag and a few of those tunes. So that was
Mm-hmm.
as close to bluegrass as we ever got.
Sure, sure. Compare the differences, like in the studio or touring with between Still Inside and Backwaters.
Well, like I said, Still Inside, there were a lot of tunes, and we rehearsed all those a lot. And then Backwaters, and I think most of that, my memory is most of uh, of Still Inside was recorded live with not a lot of overdubbing. Most
Mm.
of the fixes were done with editing. So I think like Birdland Breakdown, we're all playing together at the same time, but there's maybe 5 different edit points. Like you know how that whole process works, where
Right.
if the mandolin solo is better in take 5, but the rest of the body is better in take 3, you just edit the mandolin solo
Yeah.
into take 3. So, and which I like that approach. Overdubbing is great, and it's definitely useful. But there's something about something happening in the moment that is very honest. And even though it's edited from different takes, it's still playing with the other musicians at that time.
Right. Right.
And then Backwaters, it seemed like he didn't have as many new original tunes at that point, and so we did a couple jazz standards. We had started playing My Favorite Things.
Mm-hmm.
Tony's arrangement of My Favorite Things was a little different than the way John Coltrane or uh, Rodgers and Hammerstein had the melody go. Or the melody was the same, but I can't remember exactly what it was, the different parts. There was a vamping part, I guess.
Right.
And then we did on Green Dolphin Street, which was really fun. And then there was a song by the film composer Dave Grusin called "A Child Is Born," and we
Right.
recorded that and Tony didn't even solo on that. It was just the
Right.
melody played twice, once by Richard Green and then once by me. But it's
Mm-hmm.
really a beautiful tune, and I think that came out very nicely.
Yeah.
And I
Definitely.
think there was a little bit more overdubbing going on at that point, because it was the touring band, but he had Wyatt come in to play rhythm guitar on
Right.
several of the tunes, and I don't think he had officially joined at that point. And then Richard Green guested on fiddle on a couple cuts.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
So those are the main differences in those two. But
Yeah.
like you said, he doesn't get, maybe those records don't get the recognition that some of the others do. But Tony always cites had always cited uh, Backwaters and Manzanita as being his two favorites. So
Right.
that's an honor to me.
Right, yeah, definitely. And I'm just checking here that it looks like that Backwaters and the Bluegrass album band. Well, actually, it looks like the Still Inside and Bluegrass album band one came out the same year, and then Backwaters and Bluegrass album volume two came out the same year. So that's really interesting to be working on those two projects. Were they going on simultaneously, or
Well, no, he just I can't remember how it worked out, but he would always have some other project going. Like I think
uh,
Skaggs and Rice maybe was recorded just before I hooked up with him,
oh, okay,
and then we recorded Still Inside, and then maybe later that year is when he did the Bluegrass album band,
got it.
and I got to go by the studios for the sessions, which was it's
Yeah,
pretty amazing hearing those guys
yeah.
sing live. I mean, that was definitely live and just standing in a circle playing that music. And he also recorded album, sort of more or less a solo singer-songwriter type album. I think it was called Church Street Blues for Sugar Hill
Right.
during the time I was playing with him. So he
Oh,
just
okay.
he still sang. He just
Right.
didn't sing with that group.
Right. Right. There's actually another project that I wanted to ask you about that the internet seems to have very little information about, and that is the Bluegrass Suspects,
Right.
which is incredible because the first two cuts sound like it's Bluegrass album band, but it's with you, and it's just awesome. I love the rock hearts. The only information I could find was like a 2 minute clip of Tony himself saying that it was basically the idea of what I think was the owner of Kaleidoscope Records, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yeah, as in a way that the Bluegrass Suspects, the concept of that recording was I think Tom Diamont and Jeff Alexson's idea, but there were a series of LPs put out by a musician named Tom Stern, who was a banjo player in the Bay Area, really good banjo player, and he played some with Frank Wakefield, and he decided just to make these records, and they were all over the map. It was electric blues, and there'd always be a few bluegrass cuts because he wanted to play banjo. So
Right.
he the band I was in at the same time, the Good Old Person, he basically got most of us to play some of our tunes, but he played
Yeah.
banjo. And then since Tony was there, he got Tony to sing some, and Tony got
Hmm.
invited me to come and play mandolin. And those they were like maybe five different volumes, and they were just called I think it was called the Usual Suspects.
Hmm.
So what they did, Kaleidoscope did, is they took all the bluegrassy material from those five recordings and released it on their label.
Ah, I see. Okay, I understand. I got it. Right.
Yeah,
Uh huh.
yeah.
Wow.
And I remember thinking, just recently, like I hadn't heard that for a long time, and that was the only bluegrass I ever recorded with Tony. And I thought,
uh,
yeah, I don't think I played that good. It doesn't sound,
uh,
And but then I listened to I can't remember which tune. If it was Rock Hearts, and I thought, oh yeah, that sounds good. That sounds like
yeah,
bluegrass. So it was
it
cool
sounded really
and,
good.
and Pete. I guess Tom got Pete Rowan to come and sing tenor after the fact.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't all live for that one.
Well, mostly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. What a lineup! You and Tony and Peter and yeah, it was just an incredible disc. But then, like 2 tracks later, it's Frank Wakefield, and like you said, so I wondered how that how that all came
Yeah,
together.
it was a collection of the bluegrass tunes that he recorded over I don't know several years. How
Got it.
did you get a hold of it?
I found it. Well, I was searching online just for stuff, and then actually a few years ago there was a track uploaded on YouTube of Tony playing rock hearts, and I thought, oh, that's probably the Bluegrass album band. I listened to it, and I said, no, that's not at all. And it almost the way he counts it off, one and two, and I thought that might be like a jam session because there was no info on the upload at all. And
Yeah,
then later, someone, I don't know if they re-uploaded it or just added to it, but then they clarified that it was from the Bluegrass Suspects. And so
yeah,
then that's, yeah.
yeah.
Well, what the next thing I want to ask you is what originally made me reach out to you was your post about, of all people, Heinz Hollager. So I'm really curious what the music was that you all were listening to at that time, and like, what would be on during lawn drives, or just some of the records that were going on, because that just blew my mind to know that he was listening to Heinz Hollager.
Um, well, he had pretty wide-ranging taste in music. It
Mm.
was mostly jazz, mostly kind of modern jazz. He really was into this piano player named Tete Montolu,
Hmm.
and the bass player Niels Horning at Orsted Peterson, and I forget. There's a few other musicians that he listened to a lot. But then there was slightly more mainstream stuff like the Heath Brothers and George Coleman. So we'd listen, and I don't think we listened to stuff in the car so much, but this was at his house, and he had this
Sure.
awesome stereo system. So we just sit there, everyone's silent, just letting the music play and listen to that. But he also had some classical music, and he liked this Heinz Hollager,
Yeah.
and I remember he saying, "Listen, he plays that lick you do to me," which was because I used to play this kind of staggered arpeggio lick, which is I probably got from Texas fiddling, but
That's incredible.
I don't know.
What kind of music were you listening to at that point?
Oh, well, I mean, Tony turned me on. I mean, I mainly like the more mainstream stuff like the Heath Brothers and
Mm.
George Coleman, but I liked bluegrass a lot still
Mm-hmm.
and still do.
Mm.
So I listen to bluegrass, and I like some. I remember we went to the Rounder offices
Sure.
on that national tour when we played in Boston, and they had all these returns of LPs that maybe skipped or something, and they said, "Oh yeah, take any of that stuff you want." So I just grabbed all kinds of stuff, and there I think I got several Pierre Ben Suzanne records, and I remember really digging his stuff, and later recorded a tune called Palomito Blanca that I learned off of one of his records,
Wow.
Argentine Paso Doble.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see what else. I love Django Reinhardt.
Sure.
Um, I think that was pretty much it. Jazz and swing and whatnot, and played music with other musicians in the Bay Area at that time because we weren't very busy.
Yeah.
So I continued playing with the good old persons as well.
Right. Right. When did you end up leaving the Bay Area then?
I left in '92,
Mm.
and so the Tony Rice unit ended in '83, or that version, I should say. And Tony stayed on the West Coast for a couple of years, but really wasn't doing much.
Mm-hmm.
And then he moved back to the East Coast. But I had never quit the good old persons. I kept juggling both, and they were cool enough to understand this opportunity I had, so they'd get subs for me. And I played with different musicians. There was a great local Western swing band called Lost Weekend, I think,
Hmm.
and they had really great musicians in that band. It was just kind of a Tuesday night gig at that bluegrass bar. But Bobby Black, the steel player, I don't know if you're familiar with
Oh
him,
yeah.
and also Vance Terry played steel sometimes too,
Mm.
and he had played with one of Bob Wills's brothers and was in that same band, had Tiny Moore playing with him. So
Wow.
that was pretty good. So I kept playing music, and also during that time I started recording my first solo record, North of the Border, and I had recorded with Scott Nygaard, and he and I really enjoyed playing together. So we were in a few bands and whatnot. But I had met the woman who became my wife and is still my wife, Gwendolyn, and she lived in Vancouver, and we crossed paths and struck up a friendship, and more than a friendship, and decided we needed to live in the same place. And I thought, well, I like Vancouver, and she had two little girls, so I can't uproot three lives to come here to live with
Right.
the mandolin playing musician. So I moved to Vancouver, and it's been great. I still
Yeah.
live close by, and I toured there several times. So a lot of the local musicians knew who I was, so I got work right away, and a lot of session work, and you know,
Right.
just it just made a new life here.
Sure. Speaking of Scott, I never had the chance to tell you directly, but I had him on my old radio show at Berkeley right after your album, The Harmonic Tone
Oh,
Revealers, came
cool.
out, and that is just one of the best recordings I've ever heard.
Oh, thank you.
Partially because the sound is just pristine. I mean, the mics and the engineering on that is just beautiful. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it sounds like you're playing, I don't know, like a few inches from me. I mean, it's just beautiful recording.
Well,
Um,
yeah, that was a lot of fun to do, and it was a great opportunity. Sage Arts is a record label and studio in Washington State, and
hmm,
they had just built this new facility and were just kind of testing it out, and they were letting some musicians just come and record to see what their gear was like. And
hmm,
then Ethan Jaskovia,
hmm.
I think that's how you pronounce his name. He was the engineer, and he had been the house engineer at Compass Records, and he's a great
Hmm.
guy and really good engineer. And they had this arsenal of microphones. Like I looked down, and there were all these high-end Sheps, and I can't remember all the brands, but just it was pretty great. And that was all essentially live, but with
Yeah,
edits, no
yeah.
overdubbing at all. And we just sat in a circle, so it was very organic, and it was the ideal situation because we had the repertoire, and I booked a tour for us of just small shows, house concerts and whatnot, starting in the Bay Area and working our way up north through Oregon and Washington, and we ended up in the studio. So we really had that stuff pretty dialed in.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
glad you liked it.
Oh well, one of my favorite tunes ever is "Half Past Four." So as soon as I heard that, and a slightly little bit different treatment to it, I fell in love with it immediately. That was so great to hear that tune.
No, thanks.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's unusual in the fact that we're playing unison on two mandolins, which you don't hear. Sometimes in old time music you hear that on fiddles, but
Right. Well, and also not taking it, like as fast as possible, which is like, the trend, the trendy thing to play as fast as you can. And you guys just did it really nice, and I love how it sounded. It was
thank you.
just nice to hear it at a comfortable tempo instead of, burning it up.
Thanks.
Um, Lastly, I wanted to ask, what's next for you, or what's next for the Jaybirds, or how is, who knows what 2021 is going to hold for us this year, but,
Yeah.
in an ideal situation, what will be up and coming for you?
Well, I started a new solo record last year before
Great.
COVID,
Mm-hmm.
and so I had four tunes recorded, and then COVID hit, and I was trying to figure out how to do these various workarounds to get, but I was able to get those four tunes mixed, and then I did one session at the end of the summer as a trio
Mm.
with myself playing octave mandolin, and my friend Nick Hornbuckle, the banjo player from the Jaybirds, playing banjo, and Trent Freeman, you may know of. I think he went to Berkeley at some
Mm.
point, playing fiddle. So that was pretty fun.
Yeah.
And then a few other things. I just tried to figure out how to work around this. And most recently, I went into the studio by myself and just played rhythm to a click, and then overdubbed the lead, and I'm really happy how it turned out. And so
Great.
so maybe the recording is going to be half live with musicians and half sending tracks around for musicians to overdub to.
Yeah.
So hopefully there'll be a new John Reischman solo CD in the spring.
Oh, great. That'll be
Yeah.
great.
And then the
Yeah.
Jaybirds, it's unknown when we can get together again, but we
Right.
really need to record since Jim Nunley, our longtime guitar player, left about 2017, and
Mm.
Patrick Sauber, great musician, came on board playing guitar, but he's a
Yeah.
multi instrumentalist. He plays great Scruggs style banjo, and he's
Right.
also, I always say, he plays the mandolin a little too well.
There you
But
go. Yeah.
it's it's been exciting having him in the band, and I'm anxious to get that band recorded, or that version of the band recorded. So we'll see how that'll work.
Right. And then lastly, is there any funny or maybe a very memorable story that you can share about Tony?
Well, I could, he's I mean Tony's was really a funny guy. You know, he had a good sense of humor, and he'd just have these different stories that these old timers he'd encounter and whatnot. You know, and he'd you know not in a derogatory way, just amusing. So I
Yeah.
can't think of anything specifically, but he was just very very funny guy. You know, his persona on stage is pretty serious,
Right,
but
right.
he was just fun to hang out with, and
Great. Well, that's awesome. Oh,
so,
one last question, because I've heard some of his other band members talk about this. Back then, was there? I've heard that he was kind of famous for just going up there with not much instruction for the other band members, and just kind of like let's go. Was it like that for you? Not too many directions for the tunes, or
uh, yeah, not really. In fact, I think I asked him too much about what he wanted or wanted, and at some point he just seemed kind of he says, I can tell you, but pretty soon you're gonna have to just figure it out for yourself. So, but I was a young guy. I hadn't played really not that long.
right?
I think I was 24 when I joined the band, and really hadn't been playing seriously that long. Maybe 5 years, something like that. So, plus it was Tony Rice, so I wanted
Yeah,
to make sure I was doing the right thing. But I think he just wanted, and I've talked to Sharon about this. He just wants you to. He doesn't want to tell you what to play. He just wants you to play.
right.
And
Yeah,
I think I did that to a certain extent, but I just wanted to make sure
yeah.
I was doing what he wanted. So,
Right, right. That's great.
but
Did you?
overall he was very positive and
Sure.
encouraging. But then I think maybe at some points he was dissatisfied, but not that good at communicating what the issue was, and so I don't know.
Yeah. Did you ever cross paths like on stage after that, like years later? Was there any chance opportunities?
A little bit. I'd see him. After he moved to the East Coast, I didn't see him very much at all. But I
Right.
remember seeing him at Merle Fest one year and
Oh,
being in
sure.
some jam together. And actually, this was still when he was on the West Coast. We played at the Good Old Persons played at the very first Strawberry Music Festival,
Mm.
and the David Grisman Quintet was there, and they had Tony come in as a special guest,
Mm.
and then we were in a jam together on there. But um, I actually was in communication with him in 2012 when I made my CD Walk Along John, and
Right.
I talked to he and Todd about recording a couple tunes, and Todd was into it, and Tony was really into it too, and we text back and forth, and then when I went to set a date, I just wasn't hearing any response,
Mm.
and I think that's really when he was struggling with his hands,
Mm.
and he never said this, but so I said, okay, I guess that date isn't going to work. And then he'd come back and say, oh yeah, no, but we'll get it done. So
Mm.
he seemed like, he was positive towards the concept, but it
Right.
just coincided with that time where he really just dropped out of sight.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Mm.
I was really anxious to revisit that musical relationship,
Right.
having, grown, and I feel like I matured and, better musician. I can't play
Yeah.
as fast, but I think I'm a better musician than I was then.
Well, and if I recall correctly from his book, kind of circling back to what you said earlier, I believe he mentioned something along the lines of uh, that he would love to hear people visit those old tunes from those records.
Yeah.
So I would too. Maybe we will hear some new groups take on some of these
Yeah,
tunes.
he cited this one tune, Moses Soul, on Still Inside. That's really a
Right.
beautiful tune. And
Yeah.
his ballads, or I guess Waltz for Indira
Right.
from
Right.
Marwest, that's just a beautiful tune.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
he's
yeah.
a talented composer.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely, and to think that like last week that in Grisman's post he said that Tony originally told him he couldn't write a song. That's so
Yeah,
fun.
yeah,
But a lot of people are like that. That they are timid about it, but then just need to be encouraged. And then they unleash hundreds of amazing things. So
yeah. Well, I'm then Devlin. That was an early tune. That's
yeah.
really beautiful. And one of my favorite tunes of his, which I think we worked it up, but never really performed it that much. Was Neon Tetra.
Yes, yes.
That's
Oh, I
an
love that
awesome
tune.
tune.
Yeah.
All the key changes and the different parts. It's just a beautiful tune.
Right, right. Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time for this
Oh,
conversation.
absolutely, Matt.
It's so much
Happy to do
fun
it.
to hear these memories, and yeah, it's just great. The only other thing is, I hope to see you sometime when we can all get healthy and resume jamming and music.
Yeah,
I hope.
yeah. I'm looking forward to it for sure.
Yeah. So, and the East Coast will always be waiting for you.
Okay. All right.
Well, thank you, and have a great day.
Yeah.
See you.
Okay. Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
Take care. Bye.
You too. I hope you enjoyed hearing from John as much as I did. And again, a huge thanks goes out to John for his time to do this conversation with me. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you for watching these videos. Thank you so much to everybody, especially to John. I hope next week I will have another special guest, someone who has collaborated with Tony maybe longer than anybody else. Who will that be? Stick around to find out. See you then.